The war to end all wars ended nothing. In 1918, the guns of World War I fell silent. But beneath the ashes, the seeds of a far greater storm were already taking root. This is not the story of how war ended. This is the story of how the world was tricked into thinking peace had come. When World War I ended, the victors gathered in Versailles, not to create peace, but to dictate punishment. Germany was forced to accept full blame. Its military was dismantled. Its economy was shattered by impossible reparations. Its people humiliated. Across the world, the so-called peace created anger, poverty, and nationalism. In Italy, veterans returned to unemployment. In Japan, racial discrimination by the West sparked resentment. And in Germany, a nation once feared now crawled in shame, desperate for a savior. In this chaos, dark ideologies found light. In Italy, Benito Mussolini seized power, promising glory and empire. In Japan, military leaders took control, dreaming of Asian domination. And in Germany, a failed artist, war veteran, and political nobody, Adolf Hitler, began to rise. He promised revenge. He promised jobs. He promised to make Germany great again. And the people listened. In 1929, the world economy collapsed. Banks failed. Factories closed. Millions were jobless. And in desperation, the people turned even harder toward the extremes. In Germany, democracy was collapsing. In 1933, Hitler became chancellor. 1 year later, democracy was dead. In Japan, military leaders invaded Manchuria. The world watched and did nothing. Hitler broke the treaty. He rebuilt the military. He reoccupied the Rhineland. He formed alliances with Mussolini and Japan. Together, they formed the Axis. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia. In 1937, Japan launched full war on China. And in 1938, Hitler took Austria without a single shot fired. Appeasement, fear, silence. The world kept pretending that peace was holding. But the storm could not be held back. In 1939, Hitler signed a secret pact with Stalin, and on September 1st, he invaded Poland. The Second World War had begun, not with surprise, but with the final step in a long, slow march. A march the world refused to stop. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1st, 1939, the world changed. Within minutes, bombs were falling on Warsaw. Within hours, tanks had crossed the border. And within days, the deadliest war in human history had begun. But this was not sudden. This was a spark, igniting a fire that had been building for decades. Adolf Hitler never hid his ambitions. In his book Mein Kampf, he wrote of Lebensraum, living space for Germans in the East. Poland stood in his way. In August 1939, Germany signed a shocking pact with its ideological enemy, the Soviet Union. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a secret deal to divide Poland between them. The rest of the world watched, confused. But Hitler was now ready. The German attack was unlike anything the world had seen. It was called Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Fast-moving tanks, devastating airstrikes, shocking speed. Poland's outdated army, brave but ill-equipped, was overwhelmed. In some cases, they fought on horseback against tanks. On September 17, 1939, from the east came betrayal. The Soviet Union invaded. Poland was crushed between two giants. In less than 1 month, the country ceased to exist. The world had failed to stop what was coming. 2 days after the invasion, Britain and France declared war on Germany. But it was too little too late. No major military action followed. This period became known as the Phony War. Months of waiting while Hitler grew stronger. Appeasement had failed, but fear still ruled the West. For Poland, the consequences were catastrophic. Thousands of soldiers died in just weeks. Civilians were bombed, deported, and executed. The Nazis began their brutal rule in the West. The Soviets deported hundreds of thousands to Siberia, and in a forest called Katyn, they would later massacre over 20,000 Polish officers. Poland had become the first victim of the coming darkness. The spark had become a blaze. Germany had won its first war with terrifying ease. The world was now at war, but few understood just how far it would go. This was only the beginning. SUF CTA. Like, subscribe, and continue the journey. In 1939, war was declared, but for months there was silence. Then, in the spring of 1940, the storm finally broke. France, one of Europe's greatest powers, collapsed in just 6 weeks. And Britain stood alone, facing the full fury of Hitler's war machine. After invading Poland, Hitler waited, so did Britain and France. This eerie calm became known as the Phony War. But Hitler was preparing a masterstroke. In May 1940, he struck. And the silence shattered. While the Allies waited behind the massive Maginot Line, Hitler's forces did the unthinkable. They invaded through the Ardennes forest, a place they believed tanks couldn't go. They were wrong. In days, German panzer divisions tore through Belgium, Luxembourg, and into France. The French army and British Expeditionary Force were outflanked and surrounded. Over 330,000 Allied troops were trapped at the port of Dunkirk, surrounded by Nazis and pinned against the sea. Then, the impossible happened. Britain launched Operation Dynamo. Navy ships, fishing boats, lifeboats, even small sailboats crossed the channel. Under constant bombing, they evacuated nearly the entire army. A defeat turned into a defiant escape. Churchill would call it a miracle of deliverance. Just weeks after Dunkirk, France fell. On June 14, 1940, German troops entered Paris unopposed. The French government surrendered soon after. Hitler stood victorious in the heart of Europe. A once mighty empire had collapsed in 46 days. Now, only one enemy remained: Britain. Hitler turned his sights across the English Channel. He planned Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. But first, he needed to destroy the Royal Air Force. What followed was the Battle of Britain, the first major battle fought entirely in the sky. British radar gave early warnings, but the Luftwaffe outnumbered the RAF. Germany bombed airfields, factories, even cities, but the RAF fought back hard. The skies above Britain turned into a deadly dance of fire and smoke. Thousands died, cities burned, but Britain held the line. And then came the words that would define the resistance. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Winston Churchill. The RAF had done the impossible. Britain survived. Hitler had conquered Europe but failed to break Britain. For the first time, the Nazi war machine had been stopped, and the world began to hope. They were never meant to be allies. In 1939, Hitler and Stalin shocked the world by signing a non-aggression pact. They carved up Poland together, but beneath the handshake was hate, and in 1941, that pact burned. Hitler turned on Stalin, and the largest land invasion in human history began. For Hitler, the Soviet Union was more than a threat. It was his obsession. He saw communism as evil. He saw Slavs as inferior. And he saw the USSR's land, vast, rich, and full of Lebensraum. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a betrayal so massive it stunned the world. Over 3 million soldiers, 3,000 tanks, and 2,500 aircraft stormed eastward. It was war on an unimaginable scale. The Red Army was caught off guard. Thousands of planes were destroyed on the ground. Entire divisions were surrounded and wiped out. In just 3 weeks, German troops had advanced 500 miles. Cities like Minsk and Smolensk fell. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured. The Soviet Union was bleeding. But Hitler made critical mistakes. Instead of focusing on Moscow, he split his army, sending troops to Leningrad in the north and the oil fields in the south. This delay gave Stalin time. Factories were relocated deep into Russia, new armies were raised, and for the first time, the Soviets held the line. The Eastern Front wasn't just a battlefield, it was hell. As the Soviets retreated, they destroyed everything: crops, factories, homes, in a scorched earth policy. The Nazis responded with terror. Entire villages were burned, millions of civilians were murdered. This wasn't just war, it was extermination. In the north, German forces surrounded Leningrad. What followed was a siege that lasted 872 days. Bombs fell daily, food ran out, people ate anything they could find. Hundreds of thousands died, but the city did not fall. By late 1941, German troops reached the outskirts of Moscow. Victory seemed near. Then came winter. The same Russian winter that had destroyed Napoleon's army now struck again. Temperatures dropped below -30 degrees. Engines froze. Guns jammed. German soldiers were not prepared. And then the Soviets counterattacked. Fresh divisions from Siberia, hardened and ready, pushed the Nazis back. Moscow had been saved. Operation Barbarossa was meant to be a lightning victory. Instead, it became a brutal, frozen nightmare. The Nazis had underestimated the Soviet Union, and the war had entered a new, more terrifying phase. The tide had not yet turned, but for the first time, Hitler had failed. December 7th, 1941. A date that would echo through history. It began as just another Sunday morning and ended with the United States plunged into the deadliest war the world had ever known. This is the story of how a surprise attack woke a sleeping giant and turned a European war into a truly global conflict. While Europe burned, another storm brewed in the Pacific. Japan, driven by its empire dreams, had invaded Manchuria in 1931 and China in 1937. The United States condemned the aggression and in 1941 imposed a crippling oil embargo. Japan faced a choice: retreat or attack. They chose war, and they chose to strike first, without warning. At 7:48 a.m. on December 7th, 1941, over 350 Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The Americans were unprepared. Battleships burned. Planes exploded on the ground. In just 2 hours, over 2,400 Americans were killed. 21 ships were damaged or destroyed. The Pacific Fleet was crippled. It was the most devastating foreign attack on American soil in history, and it was only the beginning. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the nation. His words would become immortal, a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan almost unanimously. Within days, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. World War II was now truly global. While the world focused on Pearl Harbor, Japan moved swiftly. They invaded the Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya, Burma, Thailand, and the Dutch East Indies. Victory after victory. They called it the creation of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. But in reality, it was brutal imperial conquest. Civilians suffered. Prisoners were executed. Japan now ruled a vast empire, stretching from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean. The Japanese hoped Pearl Harbor would paralyze America. They were wrong. Instead, it unified the nation. Factories that once built cars now built tanks, planes, and warships. Millions enlisted. The arsenal of democracy had been unleashed, and the United States, now at war with the Axis, began to prepare for a global fight. By the end of 1941, the world was on fire. Europe was under Nazi control. Asia bowed to the Japanese Empire. North Africa was a battleground. And now, America had entered the war. No one would remain untouched. World War II had become total war, fought on land, sea, air. 1942. Hitler stood at the peak of his power. From the beaches of France to the gates of Moscow, Nazi banners flew. But on the banks of the Volga River, a city bore the name of his greatest enemy, Stalingrad. And here, his empire would begin to fall. After failing to take Moscow, Hitler turned south. His goal? The oil fields of the Caucasus, the fuel for his war machine. To secure the flank, he needed one city, a symbolic city, Stalingrad, named after Stalin himself. It was meant to be a statement, but it would become a graveyard. In August 1942, the Luftwaffe unleashed hell. Stalingrad was bombed into rubble, but the Soviets did not flee. Instead, they dug in. Stalingrad became a city of snipers, fire, and ruin. Fighting took place house by house, floor by floor, even room by room. Some soldiers lived in basements and died a few steps away. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Supplies ran low. Food was scarce. But still, both sides fought. German soldiers, once proud victors, now froze in trenches. Soviet defenders, many just teenagers, held on with desperation and hate. Every inch was paid for in blood. In November 1942, the Soviets struck back. Their plan, Operation Uranus, was simple and brilliant. Encircle the enemy. They didn't hit the German elite. They went around them, crushing the weaker Romanian and Hungarian flanks. In days, 300,000 Axis troops were trapped inside Stalingrad, cut off, freezing, and forgotten. German generals begged to retreat. Hitler refused. He ordered his army to stand and die. The Luftwaffe tried to resupply the trapped 6th Army by air, but it failed. Every day, men starved, ammunition ran dry. They ate horses, then rats, then nothing. On January 31, 1943, German Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered. It was the first time in history a German field marshal had surrendered alive. Of the 300,000 men trapped in Stalingrad, only 91,000 surrendered. Only 5,000 would ever return home. The rest died. In snow, in silence, in Siberia. Stalingrad wasn't just a battle. It was the turning point. The myth of Nazi invincibility was broken. From this moment forward, Hitler would only retreat, and the Red Army would begin to march west toward Berlin. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Empire surged across the Pacific. Island after island fell. America had been caught off guard. But 6 months later, everything changed. At a small island called Midway, the tide of war turned, and Japan would never recover. In early 1942, Japan looked unstoppable. They had conquered the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, Burma, and more. They believed the U.S. would sue for peace. But America had just begun to fight, and in June they got their chance to strike back. The key to victory came from silence. American codebreakers cracked Japan's naval plans. They discovered Japan's next target was Midway Atoll, a tiny island, but strategically vital. Admiral Chester Nimitz set a trap. Instead of being surprised, the U.S. Navy was waiting. On June 4th, 1942, the Japanese launched their attack. They struck Midway Island, but couldn't find the American carriers. Then, U.S. dive bombers found them. In just 5 minutes, they sank 3 Japanese carriers. By the end of the battle, 4 carriers were lost. The heart of the Japanese fleet was gone. It was a staggering blow, and Japan never recovered its offensive power again. After Midway, the U.S. launched a bold new strategy: island hopping. Instead of attacking every Japanese stronghold, they would leap from island to island, capturing key positions and cutting off the rest. The first stop, Guadalcanal. It was a brutal 6-month battle in jungle, mud, and blood, but it proved Japan could be beaten on land. Island by island, the Allies moved closer to Japan, from Tarawa to Saipan, Peleliu to Iwo Jima. Each step was bloody. Japanese soldiers fought to the death. Civilians were told the Americans would torture them. The result was catastrophic. Tens of thousands died. Each victory came at a terrible cost. By 1945, the U.S. had captured bases within range of the Japanese mainland. American bombers now lit up Tokyo. Japan was on the defensive, but their leaders still refused to surrender. The closer the Allies came, the more brutal the resistance became. The Pacific had turned. The island empire of Japan was shrinking, but the road to Tokyo would be soaked in blood. The worst was still to come.
For nearly 5 years, Europe had lived under the shadow of the swastika. Hitler's empire stretched from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow. But in June 1944, the Allies came back. They crossed the sea, stormed the beaches, and began the liberation of a continent. This was D-Day. Hitler knew they were coming, just not when or where. He fortified the western coast of Europe, calling it the Atlantic Wall. Thousands of bunkers, mines, and machine guns lined the shores. But no wall could stop what was coming. The Allies prepared for the greatest amphibious invasion in history. The invasion was called Operation Overlord. Planning took over a year. Millions of men, ships, and aircraft were gathered. The target? Normandy, France. 5 beachheads: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. The goal was simple: break through and never stop. On the night of June 5th, over 24,000 paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines. Their mission? Sabotage, disrupt, and hold until reinforcements arrived. Wind scattered them. Confusion reigned. But they fought on, alone, in darkness, deep behind enemy lines. At dawn, The sea erupted. Over 5,000 ships crossed the channel. 150,000 troops hit the beaches. At Utah, the Americans pushed forward. At Gold, the British broke through. At Juneau, the Canadians held the line. But at Omaha Beach, hell opened. Machine guns tore through the first waves. Bodies fell into the surf. But wave after wave they climbed, they crawled, and they broke through. French resistance fighters struck from within. Allied bombers hammered German supply lines. And in the fields of Normandy, soldiers fought not just to survive, but to free a continent. Within days, the beachheads were secure. Within weeks, Paris would be liberated. D-Day was not the end, but it was the beginning of the end. The Western Front was open. Hitler now faced enemies from the east and west.
By 1945, Hitler's empire was collapsing. The Red Army closed in from the east. The Allies stormed in from the west. Germany was surrounded and burning. The Third Reich, once feared, now cornered, faced its final hour. This is the story of how Nazi Germany fell. After D-Day, Allied forces raced across Western Europe. They liberated Paris, crossed the Rhine, and entered Germany. Meanwhile, the Red Army crushed German forces in the east, recapturing Warsaw, Budapest, and driving toward Berlin. Every mile was soaked in blood, every city burned. In December 1944, Hitler launched one last desperate counterattack, the Battle of the Bulge. In the frozen forests of Belgium, German forces tried to split the Allies. It was bold, it was brutal, but it failed. Germany had wasted its last reserves. Now the Allies rolled forward, unstoppable. As Allied forces advanced, they found something no one expected: the Holocaust. Camps like Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau were uncovered. Gas chambers, mass graves, starving survivors. Over 6 million Jews had been murdered, and the world finally saw the true face of Nazi evil. In April 1945, the Soviet Union reached Berlin. The final battle began. For weeks, the Red Army fought block by block. The city was turned to rubble. Nazi troops, including old men and teenagers, defended to the death. Inside a bunker beneath the capital, Adolf Hitler waited for the end. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life. His empire was gone, his capital in ruins, his promises ashes. 2 days later, Berlin fell. The swastika was replaced by the red Soviet flag. On May 7th, Germany officially surrendered. On May 8th, the war in Europe was over. This day became known as VE Day, Victory in Europe. Church bells rang, people danced in the streets. But behind every cheer were years of pain, loss, and sacrifice. The Nazi regime had lasted 12 years. It left behind a continent in ruins and over 50 million dead. But its fall marked a new beginning. The war in Europe was over, but across the world, another storm still raged. By August 1945, Nazi Germany had fallen, but the war in the Pacific raged on. Japan refused to surrender. And then, the United States unveiled a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. This is the story of the day the sky burned and the world changed forever. Despite heavy losses, Japan fought on. Even after losing Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, surrender was not an option. The Japanese military vowed to defend the home islands street by street. The U.S. feared an invasion would cost millions of lives, so a secret weapon was prepared. In 1939, American scientists warned President Roosevelt that Nazi Germany might build an atomic bomb. This triggered the creation of the Manhattan Project, a top-secret program involving 130,000 people across 3 countries. On July 16, 1945, the first nuclear weapon was tested in the New Mexico desert. It worked. The blast lit up the sky and changed history forever. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay took off. Its target, the Japanese city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., the first atomic bomb ever used in war exploded. In seconds, 80,000 people were vaporized. Tens of thousands more died from burns and radiation. The city became a wasteland. But Japan still did not surrender. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb fell. The target, Nagasaki. Nearly 40,000 people were killed instantly. Hospitals were flattened, entire families vanished, and yet, Japan's leadership still debated surrender. But the emperor, for the first time, broke his silence. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed his nation, a voice his people had never heard before. He announced Japan's surrender. On September 2nd, aboard the USS Missouri, the formal surrender was signed. World War II was over. World War II had lasted 6 years. It killed over 70 million people. Entire cities were erased, empires fell. The atomic age had begun, and with it, a Cold War that would last half a century. But from the ashes, something new was born, a global call for peace. The Second World War was the deadliest conflict in human history, and the greatest lesson it left us was how close we came to losing everything. Never again must the world forget.